Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Pelagonia, fought in the early summer or autumn of 1259 between the Empire of Nicaea and a coalition force of the Despotate of Epirus, the Principality of Achaia, including vassals such as the Duchy of Athens, the one of the Archipelago, the Triarchs of Negroponte, and as well the Kingdom of Sicily under Manfred, the son of Frederick II. This coalition force, as we will see now, was put together with some broader difficulty, or at least some inherent conflicts going on between all these various powers. Something that appears to have undermined, in part, the same battle performance of the Allies that we will be terming like this now, as opposed to the Nicaeans. This video is a battle one proper, so it's revolving around the tactical reconstruction of the battle. I succeeded in collecting all the primary sources on the clash, and as I sort of already expected from the general time, but especially the place, right, we do not have actually a clear idea of what concretely happened on the battlefield. At least you know that I personally specialize exactly on this part of the art of war, and so I have like immediately an interest towards particularly indicators. First of all, how the battle lines were ordered, by whom they were composed, how they interacted during the battle, right, and therefore sorting out more or less what occurred. And for this battle, it's not really clear, right? We have actually a relatively a large abundance of information, especially about the campaign, right? But when it comes to the engagement, frustratingly enough, we lack precise information about some of the larger parts of these armies and what they did in battle, if they participated. We're talking specifically about the Epirode contingent, and not only, at least there are different versions also of the same. And I would start immediately from the sources, also for all those who say, but we want a bibliographer for this. I do not list bibliographies because the things I teach here you can find easily, right? By just a simple search, like in a dedicated book to the matter. So we're talking about the major historical topics. Of course, nobody needs that. Nobody does that, even on magazines or whatever. This is not, even an academic work. But you know that habitually, for not just for the battle videos, but whenever I need to cite, to quote, I always do it, right? For the battle videos specifically, because again, I care about the very precise information referring to a particular tactical mechanic about this or that battle, which is not a battle line, doesn't equate to having a general, historical, historiographical, philosophical understanding of a major, in fact, historical theme that you, of course, can discuss without having to step every time of the way into a citation or a quote in order to make sense, or to be actually just supported by an overwhelming amount of the same, just sheer experience. So talking briefly about some of the sources that we will not even encounter, like I just in fact give them to you so that if you want to study the event as a whole, right? Some do not offer precise information about the engagement, tactically speaking, right? So there is not, first of all, a source here that appears to be particularly more or less reliable than the others. We will see that this is important for the battle criticism. The oldest historiographical source is the history book of Georgius Acropolitas, who lived during the 13th century. He was a Byzantine scholar and official, and he was involved in the theater, as he was one of the Nicaean leaders in Macedonia. By the way, the battle took place, as we will see now, in the plain of Pelagonia. We do not know exactly even where, because it's sort of a broader area, right? Pelagonia is a geographical area of Macedonia, named after the ancient kingdom. And it corresponds roughly, like at least the ancient ones, to the present-day municipalities of Bitola, Prilep. In fact, this we'll see will be named during the battle: Molia, Novaci, Kruševo, and Krivogastani, right, in North Macedonia, right. And this is again not, in fact, particularly important because it's just we do not know where the battle took place. So there is not much information about that in the first place. So Acropolitus had been captured by the Epirot forces. We will see later the political background. After the siege of Prilep in 1257, which is the same year in which the war between the Despotate of Epirus and the Empire of Nicaea had broken out. And the guy was freed only after the Battle of Pelagonia, the outcome of the Nicaean victory. And the author wrote, in fact, his history in Constantinople in 1261, after the city was reconquered by the Nicaeans. On some history books, you find that, the Battle of Pelagonia fundamentally opened the gates of Constantinople. That's not literally how it went, right, strategically and politically, but we will see this perhaps better in another video, right? Acropolitus at that point was an imperial official. He was very biased in favor of the Emperor Michael VIII, Palaiologus. I think I made a video about him. If not, we'll have to come up. In any case, as a great figure in Byzantine history, we have to come back on it again. And again, this bias derives from the fact, of course, that he depended on the ruler, and this makes him, in fact, a bit less objective as far as that is concerned. Right, there are. We can't consider Acropolitus a bit as the official version of the story. This court literates were de facto the writing the histories that we go by saying, okay, this was essentially created at the court of Constantinople, and it's essentially official history written specifically for the emperor. Then we have Georgios Paikimeres, who was born in 1242. He died in the early 14th century. He was a Nicaean, born properly in Izmik. He moved to Constantinople after 1261, and he wrote his work under the reign of Michael VIII's son, so that he was actually freer to criticize the deceased emperor, that in fact is also put under some quite shaded light by Pachymeres. Then we have Nikephoros Gregoras, who is a significantly later historian. He was born at the end of the 13th century. He died around the 60s of the 14th. He had read both Acropolitus and Pachymeres, but he adds some further information that is not derived from them. Then we have the actually most important source, that is a Latin one, right? The Chronicle of Morea. Even without our later explanation of the political background, what this era was essentially, it was a part of the Latin Empire that the Crusaders had conquered during the Fourth Crusade in 1204. And that expresses, as a source in this case, of course, the perspective of the Frankish nobility, and more specifically the one of the Principality of Achaia, right? The next to, as we will see now, Michael II, the despot of Epirus, the other great commander, it was also a bit more of a protagonist in the battle, was Guillaume de Villehardouin, William of Villehardouin, if you prefer, the Prince of Achaia in Frankish Greece. And this will be also clear because we'll be talking about the contingents, where the troops were drawn from, etc. And so this is a very important source because it's basically it's actually the most important on the battle, and it gives us the perspective of the Latins, rather, not much of the Epirotes, that were hated both by the Nicaeans and their their Latin, that they're, yes, Romanian, if we can say, and also Sicilian allies for that matter. And in fact, we do not actually have a strictly epirote perspective source talking about the battle. This is crucial because, as we will see, basically everybody speaks ill of the epirotes to the point that, bit of a spoiler, it seems that at least great part of that contingent would not actually fight together with the allies during the date of the battle, sort of, contributing to the defeat. Now, the Chronicle of Morea was written in the early 14th century. It's more definitely Western-minded. It cares about the feudal, chivalric side of the story, and it has obviously an anti-Greek bias in many ways, an anti-Byzantine one, at least. Sometimes it provides false information, but it's not doing that to redraw particularly the history of it. So, I mean, as we'll see, the Nicene sources do exactly the same. Like, they are actually, the Byzantine sources always are sort of more less insightful than the Western ones, as a matter of fact. This one is fascinating because it goes after some style and general narrative. Some mistakes are, in fact, educational rather than propaganda, right? They wanted to explain, just to harmonize certain, even clashes during the battle according to, I don't know, challenge in single combat, or at least some forms of chivalric behavior that were entertaining for the Western readers. And the interesting part of the Chronicle is that it survived in different versions that correspond to different languages. So we have the Greek, the French, the Italian, and the Aragonian version. Now, the Italian one is a bad translation, so it's not really that useful. The Aragonian one is sort of the better one. It's called Libro de los Fechos. It was written in 1393, so again, the source is earlier, but this translation is of the end of the 14th century. It does actually vary, like it's not a mere translation, because it sort of builds over the Chronicle of Morea, and that's why we have this sort of extra information, because generally speaking, the Catalan and sort of literature was emphasizing pretty much this kind of chivalric side of the story. In fact, it's similar to other 14th century Iberian sources. I had the privilege to work on some of them as well for other Mediterranean battles at some point. I don't know, think about the Chronicle of Peter IV or the Saint Montaner, right? We will be seeing them at some other point for some other battle, right? We do not know what was the original language, whether it was French, Greek, or some other one. In fact, historiographically, there is a huge debate. I'm not going to enter into the story because I'm not a historian of literature or philologist in any case, or a linguist, even strictly speaking. But it's interesting that these versions do vary slightly. However, the Libro de los Fechos is the most interesting. It's sort of the most insightful as well. There is the Greek version, then there is La Livre de la Conquesta. Another important Latin source is Marino Sanudo Torsello, Venetian nobleman belonging to the ducal family of Naxos that also lost some element under the guidance of Guillaume de Villehardouin. He, however, doesn't talk too much about the battle. This guy was born around in the 70s of the 13th century, died in 1343, right? He's actually more reliable than the Chronicle of Morea, but again, he talks less about the battle specifically, and we will not be nominating here that much, right? So if we were to look at just briefly the political background, the following can work. After the Fourth Crusade, as you know, the Latin Empire was established, but there were some Byzantine realm states that were sort of surviving. Nicaea Epirus, Trebizond were some of these. The same Latin Empire was, it sort of was choked like in its military potential at the beginning in the defeat against the Bulgarians, but its feudal structure allowed some other provinces to autonomize themselves. The Principality of the Achaia here was the most important, and the one that was trying, in fact, to hegemonize a bit the Balkans with the Latin support from Constantinople. This creating tensions with the same Epirus that was being also eaten up along the coast by Manfred of Sicily, the powerful natural son of Frederick II, who had basically stripped his nephew Conradin, the son of Conrad IV, who had come to Italy, even fought against the Guelphs together with his brother, but that eventually died. And that was carrying out a truly, Mediterranean policy. I made a video about Manfred of Sicily. We will have to talk about him again, because again, it's one of the single most important and powerful rulers of the Middle Ages, but pop culture made a pretty sorrow neglection of him. And the Sicilians essentially were eroding the Epirot coastland, reason for which the despot Michael had even married the one of these daughters to the same Manfred, and another one to Guillaume II de Villehardouin, the Prince of Achaia, who was allied with Manfred at the same time. So imagine Epirus being overlappable to more or less today's Albania. Then you have in the east you have the Thessaly, essentially, where this battle would, at least as a broader historical area, would take place in, which was a more decentralized, sort of more mountainous area, so a less powerful one, where these powers were trying to extend their own, each other's hegemony. All right. We have now, like under Prince Guillaume, as we will see now, there were different polities, of course, under Latin control. He controlled Morea, that is the Peloponnese. Then Guillaume was the overlord of the Duke of Athens, the Marquis of Budonitsa. He had Salona, the Triarchs of Euboea, the Duchy of Naxos, the County of Cephallenia, right? So, definitely the greater power also in this more coastal dimension in southern Greece, right? So the guy wanted to reestablish what had been the prior Crusader realm of Thessaloniki, right? He wanted to become the ruler of the area, and this, again, put him in contrast with the same despot Michael. So you understand why the latter, the Epirotes in general, had something against the Latins, not just because of the cultural divide, but because also they were quite aggressive, and they were, say, well-footed. For example, if they had won the Battle of Pelagonia to regain considerable amount of power in Greece at the expense of the Nicaeans, that instead essentially were across the Aegean, in Anatolia, this historically sort of quite Hellenized coastal dimension, trying to recover Constantinople, and that was their deal. As we will understand now, there is not even a clear strategic background. Like, we do not know. We know that war was there from 2 years, but we have no idea at this point exactly who started the operations in Thessaly and who wanted to start the invasion of what, right? So whether it's just the cause or the consequence of one another. As we will see now, this is important for the composition of the troops. Michael, what would become Michael VIII, Palaiologos, was in contact with Hungary, or at least a part of it, the Machpat. It is an area today, like across mostly Serbia and Hungary, that would in fact send troops against the Latins. We will see it in the Also, I made a drawing of the battle array. That's actually, believe it or not, the most difficult part of the video, because you have to be precise about the information, and sort of there is not like only one answer, only one picture, only one array. This is more or less based on the essentials that are provided to us by the sources, but also there are some things we just don't know. I had to make some choices that I will explain you in a while. All right. So a minimal strategic background. Essentially, the epirotes, to put it in this way, were in Thessaly operating, and John Palaiologos, who is the commander of the Nicaean army and brother of Michael, marches against the despot, who is also called Michael, by the way, as you understand. This was Michael II Komnenos Doukas, right? The latter, in fact, was encamped with his court, with his family and retainers, in the area of Castoria. We are already in the Thessalian theater, right? And Acropolitus says that the army of the Epirotes retreated towards their homeland, knowing of the arrival of the Nicaeans, who started under John to reconquer the cities previously lost to the enemy. Right. So first, the Nicaeans marched, because the Epirotes are Byzantine themselves. The Nicaeans marched to Ohrid and started to set up siege equipment. The city surrendered. After this, John marched to Diabolis. He set up trebuchet. There is an interesting description of this, but say it's not part of the battle, skip it. But it's fascinating because it shows you just like the regular procedure, how a siege was carried out. And some, in fact, the bombardment followed and continuous attacks were made. And we know that many townspeople in Diabolis lost their lives, many from the bulls, and so finally the city decided to surrender. These operations are very, very like they are the ABC of any campaign. There are basically normally some bigger centers you aim to, and that basically trigger the enemy's strategic response with a field army. But in the meanwhile, there are all these other fortifications scattered around towns, whatever, and you just take them so that even if something bad happens to your army, at least you can delay significantly the enemy by garrisoning them and making him waste time, even if he has won the battle, say, even though more or less you have, as always, to count primarily on the support of the local population. And in fact, as we'll see, this battle will have at least a provincial dimensional shift, like in allegiance. In any case, let's pass to the plans of the and to the compositions of the respective hosts. Let's start from the allies, right? We know that after the fall of Castoria, the despot Michael collected all the force of his land, right? So it appears at least that the Epirotes were fighting there with some sort of, medium-sized force, but like most operations were not carried out, like even in a single campaign or in the good season, by essentially a regional provincial force, by the largest army available. Here, the Epirotes learned that the Nicaeans were coming instead with, as we will see now, an adequately large force. And at that point, not just the Epirotes, but also their allies, or, as always, say concurrents, at least, ready to capitalize on the situation, being legitimately alarmed by the Nicaean offensive in the Western Balkans, sent their own aids. The King Manfred of Sicily sends 400 German and southern Italian heavy cavalrymen. These were apparently the finest force in the coalition. We will see now how the especially the German element, was considered elite, would be grouped just to open the battle, as actually the same Byzantines would. The Chronicle of Morea tells us that Prince Guillaume gathered his forces of the principality in March, right? And he traveled with them to Epirus. He joined there the despot, and together they would from there march, in fact, to Thessaly, where they should have joined forces with John the Bastard, who was the illegitimate son of the same Michael, who had John had married a daughter of a black chief in this era that was also known as Great Vlachia, and he was governing there as on behalf of his father. Right, so he was the current leader of Thessaly, in practice, at least the one that had the greater share there. As we've seen for the Principality of Achaia, alongside this, so the Duchy of Athens, the one of Naxos, Euboea, and Salona would participate. These were all vassals of Prince Guillaume, and they also sent their contingents to Thessaly. Right, I don't know whether directly at that point or if they had followed Guillaume. I think separately though, because it sort of makes more sense. At that point, he wanted first to check out the situation, then he would call these forces. But we do not have more details after all. The French version of the Chronicle of Morea tells us that the Marquis of Budonitsa had received the call. Specifically, the Libro de los Fechos states that the Count of Kefalonia participated in the campaign with his troops. So a normal feudal force, right, levied by among these allies, vassals. We do not know specifically how large the force of the Principality of Achaia specifically was. In other campaigns, it had proven to be capable of moving 400 and 500 heavy cavalrymen. Let's remember that these Latin forces were all heavy cavalry based. We'll see that the Byzantines were a bit different numerically speaking. They had their heavy cavalry, but mostly they were horse archers or lighter cavalry, at least compared to the western one. The Duchy of Athens sent 300 heavy cavalrymen in a campaign in Thessaly in 1273. So likely they would have provided with the same amount at this point. In 1276, Euboea, if you prefer, made a pact with, at that point, its Byzantine overlords to send 200 heavy cavalrymen. Again, these were essentially Latin vassals at that point of the Pelagonia. We know that Kefalonia would send normally contingents of 100 heavy cavalrymen. This gives you also more or less a size of this was the main indicator of these polities' power, how many knights essentially they could send. Budonitsa, Salona, and the Duchy of Naxos could have sent maybe a few hundreds heavy cavalrymen to Prince Guillaume. So it's a fair estimate to consider this entire force from the Latin side to be of 1,500 men. This is important because they include the same Sicilian ones sent by King Manfred that were as Latins under the Latin ruler of exception during the campaign. It was the Prince of Achaia, right, not the Epirotes. So they fundamentally the Latins and the Epirotes fought, as we will see now, in two separated contingents corresponding to two different battle lines. And so this is obvious because the two forces would be more homogeneous individuals that would specialize in their native tactics like this. Consider that next to the heavy cavalrymen there are squires, field aids of sorts, so this cannot be counted. Again, we do not have very specific information about this, but sometimes they could be, in fact, actively armed men in combat. In some other instances, there would be just literal field aids, right? Guys who watch over the camp, whatever. I'm not going to digress into this. I made multiple videos on the topic. By this point, let's say that, however, the concept that the heavy cavalryman is becoming, there is plate armor spreading. There are also, in terms of the way they were hired, etc., some hints about the professionalization and homogenization of these forces rather than the old feudal levy with the squire, etc., in an individual sense. But we are at the peak, really, of feudal culture in the West, and so the same is valid for the power of these knights, most of whom were likely, in fact, descending from the crusaders of the previous generations that had settled in Romania during the Fourth Crusade. Right? Surely there would have been some Greek among them as well. Some Latins had married into the local aristocracy, but overall there was a sort of ethnic divide, considering the Westerners as the rulers and the Greeks as the subjects. Right, but we know that Prince Guillaume had some Romans of Morea with him during the campaign of Pelagonia. This is especially true for the infantry, but also for mounted troops. Acropolitus says that these forces were mostly from Laconia, referring likely to not just the Greeks, such as the Tsakones, but the Slavs of the Taygetus Mountains. Right, the Slavs, as the Tsakones, had likely surrendered to the Latins back in 1204 on the condition, in the following years when the Westerners swarmed into Greece, on the condition that they would not pay taxes but perform military service instead. This was kind of typical. These troops were also, between the Greeks and the Slavs, pretty homogeneous. They were excellent skirmishers, right, lighter troops in general, and they would just in part be levied according to the same system that had been standing since, in fact, the Byzantine rule, right, with the Latins. We know specifically about the Slavs in the air at some point to have been armed with bows, spears. Some were protected with hauberks. So again, pretty standard equipment overall. We will surely make videos about, say, the Tsakones, the Slavs at this time and this area. Again, I made already multiple videos on Balkan warfare, but we can be ever more specific. We do not know specifically how many infantrymen there were, as we will see better during the battle for the array. Like the cavalry would be constituting the center, the battle line proper, and this infantry had an auxiliary role, likely stationed on the wings, right? So the Latins just had their own tactics, and they would normally coerce these subjects to perform such auxiliary duty. There were also Byzantine cavalrymen under the Latins, the archontes, some essentially lords, Greek landowners that had remained there, like when the Latins had arrived, transforming themselves de facto into Western vassals, right? Maintaining their posts, like this was very common. We will make videos about the Fourth Crusade and see how not too much had, a lot had changed, but at least about the basics, also the gradual privatization and feudalization of the same Byzantine system to an important degree. But we're not talking about the fact that there were already many Latins vassalized by the Byzantines as previous mercenaries of the empire, right? So there had already been a severe Western influence on this area. Same is true for Nicaea. Many of the Acritae on the Anatolian frontier were Westerners, right? This is notorious, really. We know much less about the Epirot roads. All right, we can think that he had some Latin mercenaries himself, because these were a bit the gold standard of the situation for the reason that we just explained. They could sort of easily access such pool of recruitment from the Adriatic in general. We can think of Vlach troops making most of the infantry as well, so troops from the Balkan hinterland, not different from, again, the Slavs and the Tsakonas. As a matter of fact, just a different ethnicity, except being, say, more nomadic and also mountain warfare skilled. I made a video about black infantry, as a matter of fact. It can be quite useful. So it's possible that the entire Epirot force counted something like 3,000 horsemen, plus several thousand infantry. Again, I made some estimate in the array scheme that you can look at and make all the maths that, of course, I approximated just for the sake of plausibility. And there would be a similar, say, the Byzantine ramp states had their own different styles. Of course, I don't know, the forces of Trebizond looked much closer to, say, the Turkish or Iranian ones to some extent by influence, etc. The Epirotes would resent more of Western influence, but they were essentially Byzantine forces, so you can imagine this. Large amounts of cavalry, only a minority of which were really the heavy, the ultra heavily armored ones, at least, and a majority, however, still of infantrymen. All right. So if we consider also the Chronicle of Morea, explicit information that the vanguard of the Epirot Latin coalition was of 1,000 cavalrymen and 3,000 infantrymen, and this would have most likely been lighter troops from the Epirot contingent, because they had to be more flexible, and just the Byzantine light say character would be better suited for this. We can multiply 3,000 horsemen from the Epirot contingent per 3, and so having something like 9,000 infantrymen, right? And this again depends. Also, we can think of probably the same for the Latin contingent. So a total of 15,000 infantrymen was possible, right, for the allies altogether. Speaking of the Nicaeans, instead, sources say that the army of John Palaiologos consisted not just of Roman troops, but also of Cuman and Turkish ones, or Turcopoles. The tactical difference is not relevant. They were essentially horse archers, and the latter too. I mean, but the Turcopoles were a type of trooper rather than ethnic Turks, right? I made a video about this type of soldier that had began in the Crusader states as literally like Turks that were hired, performing military service for the Crusaders, and also being settled down through some vassalatic or other form of clientery agreement to provide for this military force. And so the idea is that these were, again, pouloi in Greek is child, right? So this would have been the offspring of those Turks. But the more you go on, and especially in the 13th century, you realize that the term had come to describe the way of war of the Turks stereotypically, so the horse archer. And specifically after the Fourth Crusade, we know that given the severe crisis that struck Greece, many of the local inhabitants had turned into Turcopoles. They had started making a life as mercenaries, and considering also the strong Turkish influence that was start being felt, also the Mongol one, as a matter of fact, in the Middle East and beyond, and other peoples like the Cumans here that had always been that, like in general the Byzantines had a lot of these horse archers historically. They again would have been maybe Greek, right? Or some would be also Latin descent. We know that that would essentially, however, fight as horse archers. We know from the autobiography of Emperor Michael VIII that there were some Mysians, that would be the classicistic way of calling the Bulgarians at this point, allied with the Nicaeans. And since we have further information again of the Bulgarians, as we will see now, stationed in battle next to some other Nicaean allies, it's fair to say that there were in fact this kind of troops. After all, we've seen what the Second Bulgarian Empire had been about, made multiple videos. This was known as the Empire of the Cumans, the Vlachs, and the Bulgarians as well, because they were quite mixed at this point after the collapse of the First Empire. So they were all pretty similar, mostly fighting with this lighter type of cavalry. Of course, they had heavies. All of these peoples had, but just most of their horsemen were historically like just light. We know that the same Nicaeans had 300 picked German horsemen, which is quite fascinating, as it shows again how many Latins would be available just for recruitment. More from the origin of these Germans specifically, because there is some sort of controversy about that. But the Germans were rocking hard as mercenary cavalry at this point. During the 13th century, they were said to have surpassed the same French, or at least to be surpassing them, especially in the 14th century. German cavalry was everywhere, hired also by the French during the 100 Years' War, but by the Italians, taking over essentially even the Scandinavian political centers. And you find them here in Greece, right? So this is really fascinating, and making the best shock force of the army, right? In part, again, there is this, we'll talk more about German knighthood, but the idea that these guys had been cultivating the more typically 13th century panoply that would become, again, pretty standard for all the heavy cavalry out there, but more embodying it more, like the great helm, the at this point the 1.5-handed swords, the plate armor that had started to expand mostly from Germany, but even though was being used pretty much now by all the Westerns. Just the Germans embodied this more, and especially they were considered to be better shock chargers because of their impetus, because of the stereotypical Furor Teutonicus that, however, seems, because I can tell you that I'm actually writing an article on this very topic for early 14th century German mercenaries. It's not being true, right? The French were a bit more spent as far as that primitive force, but at least they were considered to be more prudent, more disciplined. The Germans instead were considered to be particularly violent, particularly unruly, particularly undisciplined, but when you needed to make these shock charges against everything and everyone in radical numerical inferiority and whatever, these guys would either break or get themselves killed in the process, right? And they were, for this reason, particularly appreciated, even by the Nicaeans, as we see now. We consider that the Latins of Greece were mostly French, right? Some Italian, right? The Germans were present, but we will see from the coalition side, most of the Germans were from Manfred of Sicily, so that's that. We have still, from the Nicaean side, news of 1,500 picked horse archers that were likely from Hungary, as we will see later. Then 600 cavalrymen that are described by the Chronicle of Maria as also good archers, so you don't understand whether they were mounted archers or some sort of horse archers, that apparently were sent by what it's called here, but like the king of Serbia, more of that later. Then lots of men from Anatolia that would have provided, in fact, with the numerical bulk of the Nicaean forces for obvious geographical reasons, but also because it was plenty of good light infantrymen, right, that lived on the frontier, that were sort of habituated to the Turkish raids, and they had a bit of combativeness in that direction as well. And 500 Turks proper, right? That is to say, we will see now there is some difficulty in understanding who were these guys, but it was full of Turks around, so it's not so strange to have mercenaries from this broader Turkic area, or even there should have been some Mongols. I'm sure no source says that, but surely some Mongol participated in the Battle of Pelagonia. Then there were, from the Nicaean side, also 2,000 Cuman horse archers. These were very, very good at harassing the enemy with shower of arrows, and especially in pursuing the fleeing enemy after the battle. True raiders, predators, the Hungarians used them. In fact, it seems that most of these sort of forces also sent by the Hungarians and the Serbians were, as a matter of fact, Cumans, because historically those forces were present, especially after the Mongol invasions, as refugees, and especially in Hungary, to form a sort of anti-nobiliar royal force. In fact, even Hungarian king would be half Cuman, because his mother was a Cuman princess. Now, the Greek version of the Chronicle of Morea says that the Bulgarians were next to the Serbians in the array. The same source says that the Byzantine commander divided his cavalry in 27 Alagia, that is a unit of bit more than 300 men. I mean, 3 Alagia would make 1,000 men usually, so this would mean mathematically, but it's not sure at all, not just because of the understrength issue, but in general just because we don't have the quantity, and nor we can think necessarily that this was particularly accurate as a number. Unfortunately, we do not have a video of the Battle of Pelagonia from 1259 from the battlefield. But this would make 9,000 cavalrymen in the Nicaean expedition as well. So you realize that actually the Nicaean and the Epirot forces are pretty similar in terms of sort of regional powers. Consider in these alliances that the sources expressing the point of view of the various contenders tend to, let's say, diminish or even conceal or ignore willingly the foreign contribution to the respective armies. The Nicaean sources do not want to recall that the empire had an alliance with Hungary, right? And part of the reason being that the current Hungarian queen was from the Lascaris family, that was, let's say, the rival of the Palaeologoi. The Chronicle of Morea does not speak of Manfred's contribution. It was also, actually, just like for the Hungarians from the other side, actually that one of the most, in this case, if probably the most important, was the elite force of the coalition, right? The same goes for Serbia, the Germans, right? We have from the Chronicle of Morea actually the information that the Nicaeans were using Germans. And as we will see now, there is a, let's say, probably an invention, right, of the author, which is a license, really. Why? Because the head of the elite Germans, as we will see, will be used by as vanguard from both sides, but in this case, specifically from the Allies side, was the Duke of Caritaina. That is a place in Greece. So the Chronicle of Morea, that was part of the, let's say, the the Latin baronies that fought for Guillaume of Achaia. But the Chronicle of Maria wants to create a parallel with and also probably at least sounding similarity to stress like the duel right between the heroes, and he wants the Germans from the Nicene side to be handed instead by the Duke of Carinthia, that is spelled in different ways by the different sources. The Greek version calls it Carintana, the French one Cariné. Right, this would be Carinthian Carinthon, and I also want to make a video about that at some point. So the Duke of Carinthia, because Carinthia was a duchy, at that time was objectively under the suzerainty of the Hungarian king. This is important because, again, there were lots of things going on. I talked about it, at least referred to recently in that video about Ottokar II of Bohemia. Essentially, southeastern Germany was being hegemonized by either the Bohemians or the Hungarians at this point. So one would say, well, so it is possible that the Duke of Carinthia would be there, right, with the Niceans. This is very unlikely. The Duke of the time was Ulrich the Third, who was a great knight and all, but is not reported otherwise to have fought in the Balkans at this point in this context, and even less to have been killed, as the story goes here. Like the Duke of Carinthia is killed by the Lord of Caritina, right? So again, both the consonants and the context, we can think that it was made up, right? But there would have been maybe Carinthians, of course, from both sides. When the sources mention the King of Serbia, this could actually mean the Prince of Moskva, as we were saying before, Rostislav. This guy was a vassal of Hungary, and he ruled essentially the area around Belgrade, also large parts of Bosnia. And he would have surely been involved in what was happening, in fact, further south. He at some point claimed even the crown of Bulgaria because of the incredible fluidity existing in the Balkans politically at the time. There are documents being researched proving the alliance existing at the time between Nicaea and Hungary. Right, and when we look, as we were saying before, at the Serbian and the Hungarian forces, we have to think that at least the majority would have been made up of some expandables, the equivalent of, well, not really the equivalent of mercenaries per se, but just the Kumans, right? So these cheap throwaway, savage horse archers from the steppes, naturally led by some Serbian, Hungarian noblemen that had to command them and keep them under in some way, right? It's, of course, there were, you see there, the picked horse archers. This would have been, we do not know, maybe they were part of the same Kuman nobility that was, as we've seen here, quite involved with, also with the Hungarian kings, etc. Right? So it's possible, here I express the possibility of the entire Nicene force having 9,000 cavalry, the majority of which being, however, light. And I mean possibly even properly light in the proper sense, that is horse archers, missile. We'll see better the reconstruction of the battle. It's not easy at all, right? Especially for the contingents, how they're listed, how we think they could have been deployed. It's all very speculative, hypothetical. We can think for this reason that both armies counted more than 20,000 men, right? The Epirotes brought more infantry than the Niceans, it seems, proportionally. Again, they were a bit heavier because they were a bit more western. The Niceans instead were a bit lighter because they were a bit more eastern, but otherwise they were pretty similar forces. And plus you have this quite strong Latin element that is, most evident in the Allies' force, because it's basically a half of the entire contingent, whereas the Nicaeans have less of these forces, probably just these German picked units, and we do not have news of many other Latins in the Byzantine ranks, in the Nicaean ranks during this battle. All right, nor for the Epirotes, but they were more likely to have them. So, considering the rest of the campaign leading to the battle, the Chronicle of Morea says that the Allies were eager to battle against the Nicaean invaders. Right? What was at stake was essentially the conquest of the whole region. Once one of the two armies would have collapsed, the vacuum would have been filled by just seizing all the fortifications, and so making a major regional advance that could bridge many gaps. And there was, as we have explained, an inherent attrition between the Epirotes and the Latins, because yes, they were all coalesced against the Nicaeans, but who would have taken over Thessaly if the latter had been defeated? Right, this was yet to be seen, and it's likely that this was a weakness of the coalition. Right, the Nicaeans, at least, even though being, as we'll see now, likely weaker in quality, right, they had more unity of command. Right. So the strategy of the Allies was to force as quickly the Nicaeans to battle, because even if they thought that they were stronger than them, also there were greater pressures from the same type of troops that they had mobilized. I mean, the Latins, the heavy cavalry especially, was very, very expensive. Right, those knights were a bit weighted, as we will see now, just to provide military service for a limited amount of time. So both the Prince Guillaume and the despot Michael were aware that the longer they stayed on the field, the more they would have spent, and this would have advantaged the Nicaeans. And instead, as we will see now, would recur to sort of attritional tactics. Harassing the enemy, hit and run, attacks to just tire them down before the major engagement. And this definitely speaks of the actual superiority of the Allied force here. The coalition force sent the vanguard that we mentioned before to plunder out there in the hope of attracting of the enemy army, making it bait. Right near the town of Servia, some prisoners of the Nicaean army were captured, and this revealed that John Palaiologos was in the plains of Pelagonia. So that's where the coalition force headed towards to meet the Nicaeans. The fact that the Allies were eager to battle is macroscopically supported by the fact that they left behind a number of towns that were in the hands of the Nicaeans already. So of course they had the deterrent power just to cross this territory and not having the local garrisons marching against them. This was a bit of a gamble, because of course there would have been some parties carrying out attacks on the supply lines and whatever, but this army was so strong that the leaders thought, okay, if we just crush the Nicaeans, all these other towns will fall immediately. And they were right, we don't have to doubt this. As a matter of fact, the things were decided on the battlefield more than the sources actually want to make you believe, as we'll understand why, right? Because just attrition would, the same Nicaeans fighting, so after all, more distant from their bases, were suffering of the situation, but they were hoping to reduce the disadvantage with the enemy by just wearing him out, and this would happen in interest of time more than with them. Very delicate balance, right? There's no, again, evidence that the Epirotes and the Latins stopped at any point to capture some of these towns along the way to waste time. They just were going for it. Again, a great display of strategic confidence and superiority. The Byzantine sources from the time of the Emperor Michael VIII stress that John, the Nicene commander, acted according to the instructions that his brother had given to him. And these were some general principles, such as, for example, like, military treatise was quite common, the Byzantines having a great tradition of that. Keep the heavier troops in the mountains and just operate in the open plains with lighter troops. Also, this advice, of course, is just for armies that are strategically inferior, right? That are scared of committing themselves in open field, and so want to wear out the enemy again with these lighter forces that you can more easily maneuver. They can flee if chased by the heavies. And until you gain that, let's say you get that disadvantage, those odds, until you can actually give battle with the heavies. And this is exactly what John seems to have done. He let the Cumans and the Turks out there. Also, those Romans were, let's say, suited for this kind of hit-and-run tactics, the lights, essentially. In the plain, and he would maintain his best forces ready for battle in the mountains, right, to come out at the right moment. So such stratagems are also a bit like typical Byzantine mentality. We get to know the stuff from, because look, we read it in the manual, but as a matter of fact, all armies at this point did this kind of thing. It's just that the Byzantines were more reliant on these so-called stratagems because they actually weren't the strongest in this context. As we were saying before, this was rendering the enemy nervous, because even though they were stronger, they realized that the enemy was sort of eluding them. And in the Principality of Achaia, the fifth elders were normally obliged to serve for 4 months in a year, while the Sicilian vassals only 3. And the reason being likely that the Principality, say, Greek-Romanian warfare was in general lighter than the Western one. So in Sicily, they had sort of a more feudally heavy system, for which maintaining, as we've seen, these German and Southern Italian knights in the field was more costly, because they were generally heavier, whereas in Greece the Latins would have similar challenges for their own heavies, but there were, as we've seen, interspersed even Byzantine horsemen, so overall they were slightly lighter than what was the case for Western Europe, and as such they could ask for a longer service, right? So, passing to the battle, I thought different ways to describe this, because some sources, again, make it very simple, while the others at least provide with more information, at least on the array, which is the key to the understanding of the battle as a whole. And as you understand here from what I'm going to say, there are also some further complications, because again there is this huge question mark of whether the Epirote contingent ever even participated to the battle, which is difficult to tell. Right? It's possible that they had fled the night before, or that the day after, also that they constituting the last battle, they would withdraw from the battlefield without fighting, right? So the few geographical information that we have on the battlefield is that it took place on the plain of Pelagonia, which is a 70 kilometer long and 15 kilometers wide flat basin surrounded by mountains. So what we were seeing before with the Byzantines hiding or operating in the tube adds up, especially when you look at the southern part, which had a marshy ground, right? So it was more complicated, especially for the heavy cavalry, but a bit for everybody telling the truth. It's not to say that the Nicaeans didn't have, heavies, as we were saying before, but they had less than the allies. And the city of Pelagonia, that is also known as Bitola or Monastir, lays exactly in the southern part of the Pelagonian basin, Prilep in the northern part. So this is like a corridor, right, beginning at Larissa in Thessaly, with a chain of plains, right, that goes towards the north, separated by more mountainous terrain between them, and therefore, being strategically relevant for these choke points that you can also expect the enemy to arrive from. And the coalition army descended along this corridor from the north, chasing the Nicaeans, right? It's likely, given the names of the towns that Acropolitas means, that these skirmishes between the two armies had began in the south of the actual plain, right? Which would speak further of a Nicaean bait of some sort, right? This was like terrain was helping the Nicaeans. Prilep was the chase, here the decoy, let's say, the one that the Nicaeans were threatening, and that or at least that would represent also an important support base in the area for the coalition forces, and that would make them safer, like in crossing this territory, right? And quite important stronghold to maintain, to chase the Nicaeans further, unless they would have given battle, which would have thus endangered them a bit more, because again, of the support that Prilep could provide to the allies. Acropolitas states that after the first contact, the two armies had been harassing each other day and night, which was kind of normal. It seems that the Nicaeans attacked the enemy soldiers going to water their horses. This is also kind of normal. There were usually some divides, some water courses between the two armies, and sometimes the soldiers of the both sides went to water their horses there, and there were some engagements starting, even major battles historically starting really like this. Acropolitas says that the coalition forces marched with difficulty towards Prilep, no doubt because of the harassment of the enemy, but also a bit, again, the terrain, the fact they were distancing themselves from their bases. And so Prilep was the ultimate destination to reach. The road passed towns such as Stanon, Soskos, and Moliskos. The coalition forces finally reached Prilep, but the situation was apparently already degrading, and the source basically makes it clear at this point that Michael fled in the night, together with his son Nicephorus and a few trustworthy men, de facto abandoning the entire force also on his own, right? And which was definitely not a good way to prompt them into combat with the Latins, right? According to whom, there was practically not even a real engagement, because when Michael fled, great part of the Epirot force, including the one led by John the Bastard, that, as we've seen, had been commanding also the Saint Thessalian forces, the ones of the area, would switch side, passing to the army of John Palaiologos, literally under his control. And so at that point, the Latin forces scattered, and most of them would be captured later, right? So consider, again, Acropolitus is making a bit of propaganda here. He's diminishing properly the enemies. He's saying that there was no battle, that especially the Epirotes were some traitors, and that the enemy coalition could not hold together in the first place. This is, according to me, not what happened, and we will see now why. Simply because the Epirotes had no interest in seeing Thessaly falling into the hands of the Nicaeans, right? Which is also what happened later. So while the Latins may have been an encumbrant presence at that point, they could have worked not to make them intervene more than much, or not being so cooperative till having arrived literally to Prilep. Again, Acropolitus is importantly biased. In fact, Pachymeres offers a different version about the events. That does speak of the Epirot betrayal as well, which would have been triggered by a quarrel very much styled after the Iliad between Agamemnon and Achilles, that would have been embodied respectively here by Prince Guillaume and John the Bastard. All right, who would at that point contacted John Palaiologos in expressing his desire for betraying the Latins. Had at that point Michael and his other son would have been left in peace by the Nicaeans, right? So the story goes that John agreed, and the two forces actually went to battle. But when the engagement started, the Thessalians would attack treacherously the Latins from the back, while the Epirotes would do nothing to stop them. All right. This, as we will see, is yet another hypothesis that I also don't think is what really happened. In any case, Sanudo confirms that Prince Guillaume had insulted the son of the despotess Michael, because of that, essentially the Greeks would have betrayed the Latins in a way or another. And there is some support to the story also from the Chronicle of Morea that gives this version, similar to the one of Pachymeres and Sanudo, representing the whole clash as actually a conflict between the brothers Theodorus, who at the time were ruling Thessaly, and Nicephorus, who ruled Epirus. Right, so the idea is that, again, the Epirot bloc was very unstable. Theodorus made an alliance with the Nicaeans, while the Nicephorus would have done it with the Prince of Achaia. So definitely there was a rift between the Epirotes and the Thessalians, and it sort of makes sense that the Epirotes would want to support the Achaeans, because their expansion would have weakened mostly the Thessalians, and not them, who were the closest, and this would have also allowed the Nicaeans to stay out of Epirus with a strong Achaean presence in Thessaly. All right. However, the same Chronicle of Morea and also Gregorus say that the Nicaeans sent secretly a messenger to the Epirote commanders, telling them that their situation was hopeless. So Gregoras says that the Latins would have actually betrayed at least what was referred in this message, the Epirotes. And while the Chronicle of Marea says that the Nicaeans were vastly superior to them, right? So this would have caused the Epirote crisis in command that would have brought again to the collapse of their force, so that some men fled, the others scattered, right? So much so that, according to the Chronicle of Marea, the same Prince of Achaia planned to escape, leaving most of his men, but the Baron of Caritina, Geoffroy de Bruyere, persuaded him to actually stay and fight alone, even if the situation was hopeless, right? So, first consideration, yes, as I often say, when you have a historical information and it points towards the same direction, in the absence of some contradiction, you should not dismiss it, right? Here, however, it is also evident that all the sources involved had a reason to at least depict the Epirotes in a negative fashion, right? Consider that the pro-Nicene sources hated the Latins as well, so there is an attempt to make the enemy appear more pathetic, as we've seen before, like that this whole business was settled even without a pitched battle. Regarding the flee of the Epirotes, we do not know really. Here in the picture, I inserted them for the sake of completion, showing you essentially how strong these forces would have been if they had fought entirely all together. It's really difficult to tell on the basis of our information about the command structure, etc., how even the Epirotes would have melted away. Whether the battle did occur, right? Because we have at least the Chronicle of Marea depicting the battle, and generally speaking, this kind of like if they want, you see, if an army wants to pull out, it can't do it without let's say betrayal or whatever. Like you can, yes, start fleeing if you have especially an enemy that is not so akin to you like the Latins, but these would at that point escape themselves before the engagement, before this. And in fact, you see here some source says that there was actually a pitched battle, in that at least a part of the Epirotes, the Thessalians specifically, would have even attacked the same Latins, while the Epirotes did nothing. So my point, even considering how the engagement between the bangers went, etc., does speak of a situation that was surely quite delicate. My idea personally is that some of the Epirotes had fled the night before. That was either in fact some say betrayal of sort, that or just low confidence among them. They may have just resented the Latins for the same reasons that were given. Again, the divide between the Thessalians and the Epirotes strictly meant may be a good key of interpretation, right? The switch in alliance by John the Bastard seems to have been the most important thing, right? I don't think the Epirotes would have, or the Thessalians would have joined forces with the Nicaeans, because it would have not made any sense. Like, they would have essentially fallen under their control, even if there was some agreement or negotiation about that. Like, their situation would have not necessarily been that advantageous. Consider that also the Latin forces were imposant, but they were sort of divided in some way. I mean, they had to come back home. While the Sicilians and the Achaeans were allied, still they were different powers. A victory would have been better, right? And the fact that these forces did give battle surely was based on the attempt, at least, of saying, let's roll the dice, let's see what happens. This may have influenced, as we will see now, the way the armies fought on the field. Generally speaking, there is a way to pull out safely of the engagement without fighting. This happened in many battles that we've seen in other contexts. It's risky on the longer run, depending on who chases you, whether you manage to maintain cohesion with an enemy pressing on you. But even these, say, single battle lines were sufficiently spaced and, generally speaking, well ordered to sort of being able to withdraw from the field safely, especially, as we will see now, that the last one, the one of the rare, that thus was more distant from the area. Normally, I calculated that between these battles, in general, in this time warfare, there was something like 500 meters, at least, of distance. So this means that the distance between the, let's say, the last line, let's say, of the Epirotes and the first line of the Nicaeans was something like 1 kilo, between more than 1 kilometers and more than 1 kilometer and a half, right? So safe enough to retreat. Of course, if you have to consider this, like the greater, let's say, the greater the losses in the battle, and the more you're going to suffer yourself. I mean, the more the losses from your side, in this case, say on the Latins, if you are an Epirote, and the more the chance of you actually suffering of the same during the retreat as well. So everything points to either, again, the Epirotes fled the night before entirely, which kind of sounds like doesn't make sense because these forces went that far for it, and that was the right strategical solution. As we've seen, the Nicaeans were not that many or particularly more advantage. On the contrary, it was the Epirotes to be, I mean, the coalition force to be stronger. All right. So this doesn't quite make sense. It's way more likely, in my opinion, that what happened on the battlefield actually triggered the Epirote withdrawal to some force, regardless of even, of course, the possible amount of force that may have left the day before the battle. There was always someone doing so, like in a way or another. That was the moment of the greatest anxiety, the greatest worries. Like, there are some beautiful pieces of literature describing what the feelings of the soldiers before battle really were. And this was the moment in which, in fact, you would separate the coward from the hero, right? Because everybody was scared, but only the strongest decided to resist. And it was just overall, like, armies do, as long as they exist physically, they do stand their ground. And so we shouldn't, I think, pay too much attention to what the sources here are claiming when they are evidently trying to discredit this side or the other. Surely there was something going on regarding especially this betrayal, which was also a thing and a possibility. But I doubt that the Epirotes were not present at the battle overall, right? The Chronicle of Morea stresses, of course, that from the Latin perspective, that in fact the Latins had been left alone, that Prince Guillaume went to battle and let's say the Nicaeans specifically went to battle against the Latins after the Epirotes had left, right? And that the Latins stood their ground. This is also not an incoherent idea. Who knows? Maybe it did happen, right? But maybe this was referring even to a certain moment of the battle, rather, or we do not really know. Surely in the days before the battle there had been an intensification of some sort of psyop, especially from the Nicaeans that had more horse archers, in fact, to harass the enemy with those, as it was typical again for the Eastern armies in general. The Westerners had, but the same Byzantines against the Turks comparatively had been through that so often, and of course, as we explained, this is a declaration of strategic inferiority from the side that is not using all the forces concentrated at once altogether, because they would know that is not enough, right? Separating them even with harassment means that you have to wear the enemy out. If you have the upper hand, you don't have to waste time. This is exactly what, in fact, the Allies were doing. We know that the battle was on Sunday, according to the Chronicle of Morea. We have some information finally about the array, right? So the Germans formed the vanguard of the coalition force. Prince Guillaume made a speech declaring that the Franks, that is, of course, the Latins, should have no reason to fear in general, because even though the Nicaeans were numerous, they were also made up of different peoples that would not really cooperate, and that only the Germans that were on the other side as well, as we will see now, would be the most dangerous opponents, which is sort of a strange speech because, and of course it's a sort of embellishment, maybe again this derived from some actual memory of the battle, but I mean, if you're, as the same source says, your own allies have just left you, like the fact that you're out there in front of an enemy that in spite of its multi-ethnicity is still sticking together, it's not really a good omen, right? If you consider the entirety, like if we were to consider again the leave of the Epirote forces, you would have sensibly depleted coalition force. We would have just 1,500 heavy horsemen against 9,000. So that would be really a hopeless situation. And again, this makes me prone to believe that aside from lack of coordination or even betrayal, this engagement was on an equal footing after all. The Chronicle of Morea also considers the Latins in general, the Franks, as the truly dangerous forces in close combat, right? This is supported by multiple Byzantine authors regarding the Latins in their style of warfare. We don't have time to digress on it, but indeed the Westerners had sort of the heaviest cavalry, and definitely the 13th century had seen, because of the collapse of the Byzantine Empire during the Fourth Crusade, the Mongol invasions, the advance of the Turks, a further lightening of the Byzantine armies in general, right? And so this was seen as a problem. As a matter of fact, it is the same one that we just exposed, also at a strategic level, that of course these armies were, say, after all, quite balanced in force in the way, otherwise it would have not met. Especially the largest engagements are the most balanced in odds, otherwise they would not take place, right? And I will not digress what I already explained in the series about von Clausewitz on this. In any case, it seems to me, just to go back to the point of the betrayal, that if there was any, this was more likely to have happened since the Epirotes were deployed in the bottom of the array, and so if things started to go wrong for the Latins, that's the moment in which they would have pulled out, which is typical. There are so many battles in which this happened in the same way, especially during the 13th century when there was this deployment in depth of the various battle lines, also pretty big battles, as this one actually for the region really is. And so different peoples were also, considering their own different interests, etc. So just the Epirotes abandoning the Latins, perhaps when they saw that the latter were doing bad, as we will see now, would be completely normal, right? And that would bring also to the disaster that for Epirus as well, that would have not had a reason just to have the Nicaeans winning instead of anyone, because the Latins were true allies in a way or another, so they were not there with hostile intentions in the moment, and they were, let's say, not even necessarily a greater threat than the Nicaeans after all. So trying to reconstruct the array is pretty complicated. I mean, it's really normal in these 13th century battles, and especially in an area like the Balkans, not to have a clear information about all the components that fought in the army, at least the way they were deployed, like they were grouped, they were ordered, etc. The basic assumption here is that both armies were, of course, deploying, as the sources are explicit about, in depth. There were thus different battle lines, one behind the other, and they would have been composed of different contingents depending on which ones they were. Right, here from the picture you can see, of course, that the allies of both sides respectively were stationed in the second line, just behind the vanguard that was basically identical, these 300 elite German knights. And the more cohesive Byzantine forces from both sides were, in fact, in the last third battle line. Right. The other assumption is that as we've seen, the coalition force had more infantry, and this would have been deployed on the wings. I'm a great proponent of this particular deployment. I've been researching for years about that, and I'm very interested in this topic because you hardly have a clear, explicit, let's say, information of this wings, infantry wings on the flanks, in fact, of the main heavy cavalry during this century until the end of it, practically, when we think they were there, right? They were just not regularly, and so being part of the most effective tactic actually that could be enacted, that is, I fight against you with heavy cavalry, and the wings are facing against one another, they clash against one another. If they break the enemy in front of them, they will fall on the enemy cavalry rear. At that point it is unprotected. In fact, battles were really won like this, with the cooperation of cavalry and infantry in this way. And so, of course, the cavalry alone could have smashed one another, but the infantry would speed up that. So the Latin Epirote side is more infantry-based, whereas the Byzantines are more cavalry-based. And the idea is that in the latter case, they would use a bit like it was typical in steppe warfare, where at least lots of horse archers were employed. The latter, the missile cavalry, be stationed on the flanks, right? And this is not even, as we will see now, an advantage per se. I mean, infantry was usually stronger than horse archers by definition, but they could also inflict very serious losses, especially disordering also the enemy cavalry. And here, unfortunately, we have no information of how these wings actually operated in battle. We just have some hint of the fact that these lighter troops, at least on the Byzantine side, were deployed on the wings, but not what actually happened during the battle as far as those are concerned, right? So this is important because part of, and nobody has ever written about this because, again, I follow the thing closely from a historiographical point of view. I don't think there is an actual documentation of wings facing infantry, let's say horse archer wings facing infantry wings and having a clear idea of how they engage against one another. I mean, you can imagine that, but how would that be crippling for example, for the infantry? For example, I studied the Battle of Markfeld, and that influenced also my interpretation of this battle as far as the second line of the Nicaeans is concerned, because you would think that there would be some sort of heavy troops in the center, right? And that's when you see here the Cuman horse archers on the right and the Alan and Turkish horse archers on the wing on the left. You think that the core was made of heavier guys. Well, as a matter of fact, there were entire battle lines that could be constituted by Cumans, right? What we were saying here regarding, for example, the Hungarians and the Serbians, mostly fielding Cumans on their own and not really ethnic heavier contingents, as they were mostly not really horse archers of the steppe types, in spite of the reminiscences of the steppe, especially in Hungary. You would have instead a unique array of heavy horse archers. In the Battle of Markfeld, that was fought just 17 years later, you have an entire array of Cuman horse archers, essentially paralyzing the movement of the Bohemian Moravian battle line. It was constituted by heavy cavalry, but that was basically crippled by the horse archer fire that could not simply smash into the enemy line, but would eventually disperse on the wings, but would put out of action in conditions of combat capability this heavier one, right? And I think that in this battle, the way they operated was sort of similar, as we will see now, especially considering that if even the center is constituted by lighter troops, you can essentially have them flow without much order, like in open order, as a matter of fact, around the flanks of, for example, the 300 elite German knights that, as we will see, will be actually taken down, at least in the horses, by the same second line of the Nicaeans, just shooting, not counting who was hit or not, even though you should be careful about every information because it's not necessarily what happened. So passing to the actual data, the Chronicle of Morea says that the Nicaeans had put their best men, that is the Germans, in the first division, right? This would have been again led by the Duke of Carinthia, allegedly, and we do not know also whether this is a Latin complement to the saying Germans to show that the Byzantines sacked, that these were the only dangerous enemy or whatever, because if you read the account, it's basically they do not talk much about else, where you just find horse archers from the, not even the Byzantine, but the Hungarian, the Cuman side, all right? So it may be the fruit of a prejudice, but it's realistic that the Nicaeans would have these 300 heavily armored German knights that, as we were saying before, were used to smash into the enemy lines. This is different from having literally an entire battle line of horsemen. I mean, 300 elite knights are really an impressive force, especially for armies here that are not really too big. I mean, the maximum normally would be, let's say the maximum, but also the level of scale in which usually battles were regional relevance were fought would be 30,000 men, right? So here 300 elite German knights, both sides, are objectively very important. They can do a lot. And normally these smaller battle lines, because this is still not normally the size of a main battle line, as you can see if you look at the others behind them, is like it's interesting. I will have to make a video about this. It has technically the function of breaking through the enemy formation in a almost suicidal fashion. These are not troops that have to survive the impact. And here the interesting aspect is that both sides have the same, so they would in part neutralize each other, but the point was to rather smash into the bigger formation, so that you would send the suicide squad to disorder that, so that if the enemy had not done the same, and you had in that sense gained the upper hand by having the guys who shock the most, who charge the most and pierce through the enemy line, your own main line would be able to overwhelm the enemy one more easily, right? So it was important to see how these engagements started, because on the basis of this initial advantage you could count of having one for the following battle lines at the same time. This is why, in fact, what happens here, also according to the Chronicle of Maria, is so relevant among these Germans fighting in the vanguard, right? So Moret says that the Chronicle of Maria says that Prince Guillaume deployed the Germans himself there. Here you see I stressed that these 300 elite Germans may have been just out there as mercenaries, all of the same Achaeans, but surely some of them were sent by Manfred. I mean, they were normally especially these vanguards were chosen on the spot. I mean, here the Latins were all together, but in order to open the engagement, they would pick the best ones they had. So these are not necessarily even German per se as a separated contingent, but they would have been made by the best ones, were the ones that Manfred had sent. So when you look at the 400 Siculo German heavy cavalrymen, you see the parenthesis means included in the 1200 Latin heavy cavalry of the main body, but they could have actually been in part like some of these just in part of the 300 elite German knights out there. It's true that Manfred made great use of German mercenaries rather than the Italian barons, but these were also important. It depends on who he sent and why, which I don't think it's ever been researched, and I don't think there is any evidence about this for the battle, so it's complicated to reconstruct in the first, or even impossible to reconstruct in the first place. The Baron of Caritina, as we have seen, was given the honor of commanding the Latin vanguard. The Libro de los Fechos claim that the Latins formed 3 successive battaglia divisions line, specifically 2 of infantry, 1 of cavalry. Now, some scholars that had studied this battle said, oh my god, there are so many battle lines. Not 3, but there are 5, because look at this, it says that these battle lines were the one of the infantry, made just one by the infantry behind one of the cavalry. No, right? What this source actually means, even if it does not explicitate that, is that, as I showed here, the battaglia, which was again the battle line, was made like you have the cavalry in the center and then 2 infantry wings on the side, right? It's not explicitated. Again, it's a foggy, they don't tell you straight away, but if you have never studied a battle in which this was the normal practice and you have not acquired a bit of let's say familiarity with, say, other battles around the same time and a bit later especially, you can't immediately point it out, because again, I'm pretty much the only person who has been publishing about this currently, so I'm right in the way of this vacuum. So this would be completely normal, as a matter of fact. The only thing that is maybe not normal, but it's just something that I add for the sake of color, is that the concept of battaglia, of battle line, would apply However, just for the cavalry. Like technically, at least the context I studied did not in fact call battaglia the actual units, like the cavalry one or the infantry one separated, but the entire battle line, which was incarnated by the cavalry, and the infantry was considered instead just like an auxiliary force that did not count as the battle itself, but just what came as the lesser people on foot to support it. Right, so this is clear because of the aforementioned tactic that was enacted by the infantry. That was just, again, auxiliary to cavalry, that at this point was the dominating and decisive arm on the battlefields, and especially in these Latin armies. Right. The Libro de los Fachos also makes clear that Prince Guillaume was, of course, himself in the second cavalry battalion, so in the main one behind the Germans, because he led the entire Latin force. The Livre de la Conquête is vaguer, but it's also normal for the sources of the time. So in total, you would have technically these battaglia. I don't know whether the 300 elite knights would be considered a battaglia per se, right? But they were more just like a picked element, let's say, extracted from the main battaglia. That's how these bangers were conceived, tactically and conceptually. This is quite typical again for Western warfare, Western tactics. From the Greek and French versions of the Chronicle of Morea, it is possible to deduce that the author had thought that in the Nicene order of battle, the Hungarian contingent was situated behind the Germans, and that the Cumans were somewhere near. Right. This is why I represented at least the Hungarians. I wanted to think that these were a bit more like elite horse archers, again drawn from the Cuman aristocracy, and so they are called Hungarians, but technically they were, because it was the Hungarian contingent, but they were not ethnic Magyars themselves. But you find them behind, in fact, the elite German knights in the Nicene array. The Cumans, as we will see later, are mentioned being stationed on the wings. So this means that these could have been lighter horse archers, so the equivalent of the infantry on the other side that was not decisive. So these elite ones were in the center, while the lighter ones of the same horse archers were stationed on. Here I decided the right, but unfortunately we do not have a better information. So of course take this drawing as my take. I haven't found, in fact, that there is anything published about the array of the Battle of Pelagonia. I may be the first person to be drawing this, as a matter of fact. So the Libro de los Fachos tells us more. It says that the Germans formed the vanguard. So, okay, the Hungarians and the Serbs formed the second battalion. So this reinforces the fact that, as I depicted here, that was the actual center of the second line, and that in the third was John Palaiologos with all the Greeks, right? So as we were explaining before, just like if the Epirotes were on the field, they would have just been this more ethnic, say this, just a despotate force, right? Byzantine ones, just like the Nicene imperial ones, would have been there on the other side, both in the last line. All right. Then the source says that the Cumans and the Alans with their bows, so making it clear that these were horse archers, were positioned in the flanks. So that's again why I chose to locate the Cumans on the right, in the at least specularly with the Alans in the left. The Alans, as you know, I made a video about them. They were Iranian horse archers and knights from the steppes that had survived in more or less today's Ossetia, and they had from the migration era in the Turkification of the steppes. And they still were so warlike and appreciated that they provided bodyguards pretty much for every great empire. Even the Mongols in China had Alan bodyguards at this point, so they were really, really cool guys. But there were also not so many, so likely they were not here present in such a strong, decisive force, and especially they were horse archers mostly, so not heavies. And they would have been influenced, of course, by the Turkic and Mongol horse archery techniques, as much as they would have historically lost part of their heavy cavalry element, at least to the migration era many centuries before. Also, we are told that the infantry formed two battalions. So, from the Nicene side, you can't say the two things. What are these two battalions? That there were 4 battalions, then in depth, actually 5, like the Germans, the Hungarians, the Byzantines, and then 2 infantry battalions? Of course not. This simply means that the third line had 2 infantry wings, just like the epiroads, right? So this is completely normal. Regardless of the fact that many horsemen in the Byzantine third line would be light, they were still all together and massed a punching force together with the heavies in the same line to be considered more than the infantry. Also, the Anatolian infantrymen they were not so heavy like, say, the Epirot ones. I think it's pretty fair to say historically we see, again, it's a different society, they're similar, but there is a difference. By the way, the proximity of these ethnic contingents from the information that we have on the battle order may derive from a similarity to the marching order rather than the battle one specifically. But again, I think it also makes sense because eventually, normally these armies were not simply marching and passing to the line of battle, so especially the largest ones, right? So we can't quite say whether normally they arrayed these lines just in the battle order. They in front of the camp, they marched towards the enemy, and so it was, right? This was not a situation in which these armies had even the need or even the capacity to perform such a thing, right? So we don't see any evidence for this order having anything to do with the one used by the column of the march. In any case, the information we have makes sense about the general disposition. The Libro de los Fachos says nothing about the Turks. This could have been confused with the Alans because in a way or another, in spite of the ethnic difference, they were similar in combat style. So that's the reason why I here arbitrarily put the Alans together with the Turks. There is actually very few information on the engagement, as we were saying at the very beginning, right? The Chronicle of Morea provides us more of most of it, like basically telling all the major details, because on the wake of that chivalric narrative of the time wanted to make a bit more like the gallant moment in which the champions clashed against one another. And in fact, he talks about the clash of the 2 German vanguards, all right? And essentially the charge opens well for the Latin side, because the Lord of Carithaina charges with his lance and pushes the commander of the Nicene Germans, we can so say, of his horse, and killed him, as well as 2 others, right? The lance of the Lord breaks, but the hero grasps his sword and cuts the enemy literally like grass. So again, the Germans were pretty hot-headed, aggressive, violent in that way. This was the moment to shine, and of course they would have behaved like that. They would have really represented again this heroic archetype of the best Western knightly tradition. Naturally, there were plenty of other Latin forces that could have equated them, but again, this in fact is the reason why they had been brought in the vanguard, because they were the best. Surely there was some other, I don't know, French or Italian knight, but it's mostly about the Germans. Now, the Lord of Caritina, however, is captured in combat. Essentially, there is a scene. It's not so important from a tactical point of view, but it kind of gives you an insight also on the clashes that would happen in multiple reprises, like different turns of cavalry charges, for which, as we will see now, the guy is taken down by the enemy arrows. Mostly the horses were very vulnerable to that, and the Byzantines managed to make him surrender, and so he gives up his sword, right? What turns the tides, apparently, in this clash? I mean, again, it's just the Chronicle of Morea that could have even invented that the enemy commander of the Germans was the Duke of Carinthia, that likely had nothing to do with that, and that he didn't, of course, even die. Maybe there was a commander of these Germans, right? We can't be fully sure whether these existed or not. On the other side, we can doubt of a lot of things, but at least that's what we have, and we can go by. It's plausible, at least, right? It does not contradict other, aside from the individual guy Ulrich of Carinthia. Like, there wasn't likely there for many reasons. Like, this two vanguards of Germans would have clashed in that way. So the main purpose, as we were saying before, of these vanguards was to break the enemy formation, and then the main battle line attacking, right? There is no doubt that the Latins were the strongest element of the entire coalition army. So if the Epirotes were on the battlefield, they would have essentially just bet on the second battle line to deliver this greatest blow, which was kind of normal, right? This was even integrated here between the Byzantines and the Westerners. I mean, you would have this ultra elite small vanguard that had to break. Then the second line was kind of the bulkiest one, the one that had to charge with mass and numbers and shatter the enemy. And then the third one, it was kind of an okay one, but not one you would rely just for the for the impetus, and that would have just to clean the battlefield when the last enemy battle line was spent, right? Very often we do not understand how this happened, but it was mostly a matter of moral force. Certain last battle lines would melt away when they would see that was nothing to do. And this is actually what would happen likely to the same Epirotes in the third line. They would abandon the field because they realized that there wasn't much that could be done. So what did actually happen? This is all the Chronicle of Morea telling us. Essentially, while the Germans were battling, John Palaiologos ordered the Hungarian horse archers to shoot the horses of the enemy without caring about the possibility that they would hit their own Germans as well, right? And we're told also that the Cumans joined the shooting. So this is interesting because it does distinguish the Hungarians from the Cumans, but again, it could have been mostly because there was some Hungarian nobleman at the head of this lighter troops, and so the Cumans as a lighter rabble would have just been put mostly on the wings, as we've seen, for tactical reasons. Remember, there were also the Serbs in between, so there was some distinction that had brought the same source to distinguish in turn. So basically what happened is that while the Germans were fighting all together, the Byzantines sent in the second battle line, constituted by the horse archers, largely, and they began to shoot into everybody. they basically don't care about the fate of their own men. Mostly, and the chronicle is correct in this sense, the greatest losses would occur among the horses that at large did not have armor, differently from their riders. You have always this horrendous list of killed horses at the end of these battle accounts that reveal constantly how true the vulnerability of the animal was. In general, it could be actually that here the Chronicle of Morea is a bit inspired even by the effectiveness that crossbows had on Western battlefields that were still in the mindset of a Latin ruling in Greece, still the gold standard. Like these were all families connected with their homeland, right, in Western Europe. So that may be a little of a topos as well. It's also strange, telling the truth, that you see, it really depends who wrote the story. Because if it was a Greek author, he would have written in a way that would have been a bit more oblivious of many details that especially the Libro de los Fechos, that, as we've seen, elaborates the further information instead, is quite rich about. I mean, the latter guy may have simply expanded or added certain elements that in the Greek mindset, or even maybe in the French account, that could have been still relatively dry, right, after all, about an engagement that was important, but was not this huge, there were sometimes at this point much more important battles going on, and this was taking place in Greece, so even just the general interest and the general resonance was less. So these are all things we must reason on that make you understand how dependent we are on information here, that we take, this is actually how the battle went, but not necessarily that is the case, right? So it may be true that at some point taking down the enemy mounts would have been a sort of a necessity. The point, though, that I would like to think being the case at the same time was the fact that since the Chronicle of Morea tells that the Lord of Carythina was captured, and so things were like basically the commander fell, and this is what the Chronicle also says, that Prince Guillaume decided to support him, all right, and his men were also shot. That basically what happened is that while the vanguards were still fighting, and while this reversal was happening, the Latins charged with the main battle, and while there were still the Germans battling as well, so they remained sort of bogged in, because at that point their charge being stopped, being spent also in a probably let's say not in a useless but in a bad way, because maybe they didn't have choices. I mean, if their own Germans were giving way, the spirit again of the entire army would have been affected by that. The enemy Germans would have kept attacking the main battle line, and the Latins would have lost in that sense the initiative. So they charged in, but the battlefield was not clean, so that this major cavalry charge that should have been addressed to the actual second battle, right, of the enemy, the one of the horse archers, was sort of spent. We do not know what would have happened if, say, there had not been the vanguards and the Latins had charged into the Hungarians and the Serbians with with their own infantry on the side, and the enemy having the horse archers on the side, and apparently most horse archers in the same center. That may have actually been the demise of the same Nicaean army as a whole, because at least if these were horse archers overall, and even if they were lighter anyway than the Latins, they would have had the worst of it. Right? We do not know what the wings, the infantry wings of the Latins would have done, the ones made up by the Slavs and the Tsakonis, so it's a bit of a mystery. There are people who debate on how the infantry could follow the cavalry in combat. Actually, they would do it regularly, also because the cavalry wouldn't charge till the last 100 meters or so they had all the time to follow the cavalry. By the way, something I forgot to point out here is that I inserted in a completely speculative way, because some scholar did so, the idea that the Latins, specifically the Sicilians, would have sent some Saracen archers together with the 400 knights, and this is merely an hypothesis that here I added it to make it a bit more exotic and and interesting, juicy, let's say, because Acropolitus says 400 men from Manfred of Sicily, while Pachymeres says 3,000 Sicilians. So the idea is that that would have been the infantry contingent, and it is possible that these were just, I don't know, southern Italian levies, or that these were, especially considering that, of course, the Nicaeans had archers, and of course Manfred knew this, and the archers had to counter other archers, especially behind the protection of infantrymen like the Slavs and the Tsakonis, that the famed Saracens from the Apulian colony of Lucera that Frederick II had deported from Sicily, like to make it in fact a military colony that fiercely dependent and loyal to the crown, that would have been in fact used by Manfred and even by the Angevins, that however wiped it out later on, could have in fact been sent. And so I added this, I put question mark because it's not really anything like even documented by anyone, but it can be interesting. We've considered that the infantry from Manfred as such. So everything is a bit of a mystery, but the point I was making is that by this apparent stroke of luck, here the Chronicle of Morea, like all the sources of the time, does not really rationalize or explicitate fully what was going on. This is mostly like a story, like an epos. It's about imagery rather than internal coherence. They didn't care more than much. But the idea is that if really the Lord of Caritina had fallen and the Germans were in trouble from the Latin side, Prince Guillaume would have intervened, and this essentially would have equated to spend their own forces to tame the enemy Germans. That would have surely been defeated by the much larger Latin force that surely had some other Germans and other very heavy cavalry from the Romanian ones of Greece and southern Italy and other places. And so the intervention of the horse archers of the second battle line would have been extremely profitable, because for the time that the Latins would have been involved with the Nicaean vanguard, the latter could pin them down, giving time to the horse archers to shoot into the enemy multitude, and in fact taking down their own horses, but in that situation really taking down the majority of the shots, at least hitting the enemy just by numerical disproportion. And here in the picture I represented this as also a flank attack, but you see that in order to do it I had to suppose at least that the enemy, say the Slavs, the Tsakonis, maybe the Saracens, did not engage particularly against the enemy horse archers, that they would have been sort of maybe taking them at a distance, or not having the possibility, at least on foot, to really chase them, they could have kept them away from the enemy, like from their own cavalry. But at the same time, if you consider that the center of the Nicaean second battle line was also made by this lighter horsemen, that these would have had the possibility of really also, with these large numbers, infiltrating in some other places. You considered this. This would have been a total of, I didn't make the total here, whatever. It's like 2,100 horsemen overall. The half of that is, let's say, 1,000 that can go left and right. So we have essentially 2,000 on the left, 3,000 on the right, or even they would have balanced in different ways. And it's almost as much as the confronting infantry wings that would have probably not been so eager to advance under this arrow fire and simply take on the enemy cavalry that easily, even if they were light, right? So they were stronger, but not to literally attack the enemy, or just not being stunned by the enemy arrows. I mean, Slavs and Sakonis may have been good, even with missiles, etc., but in this sense, they would have been ever less capable of taking on the enemy into hand-to-hand combat, especially if the enemy was mounted and could simply retreat. So I think it made sense to see the battle in this way. As you can see, I added the Bulgarians question mark as well in the center. That would be an addition included in 2,100. But again, here we are really in the field of speculation as far as the numbers especially are concerned. Alright. So this is basically how the battle went. Predictably, the second battle line of the Allies lost. The source says that the Franks surrendered basically because, especially when their mounts were down, like this was the practice, like they were so heavy, by the way, that yes, they could fight on foot, but they would preferably at that point, like especially against very light enemies, like they could fight, they could defend themselves, but they were in open ground, and there was not much they could do. There is also like an interesting note regarding the infantrymen of the coalition managing to escape, which may actually indicate the fact that these had not even engaged, and that maybe was just the Latins were abandoned a bit by everybody of the field. It's at this point that you have to think the Epirotes managing to also fleeing, and the fact that the infantry saved itself actually makes me think that this is another hint of the fact that the Epirotes had actually remained on the field, because the infantry would have been easy to chase down, especially the lighter one. They would have tried to escape more likely than the enemy knights, as we have seen. And if they had been gravitating around a more cohesive and still intact Epirote force, they would have had more chance of survival. So that may be an indicator of the fact that they were, after all, abandoned under cover. Otherwise, the enemy would have just chased them down very easily with all those light horse archers. Naturally, they broke at some point as well, especially the infantry, again, was not meant to hold in that sense. We do not see in Greece particularly strong infantries in a broader sense. Alright. So this is really it, right? So this is where eventually the coalition host disintegrated. We do not understand what is true or false from the sources, as we have seen. Some overall things are relatively accurate and or plausible, at least, like the general idea about the troops types, some certain tactical dynamics, right? The main deal being the Epirote betrayal, really, so a non-military thing technically. But again, I think this would have happened during the battle when the the despot or whoever had been left in the third line. So the Latin cavalry having the worst of it because they were being downed by the enemy horse archers, they said, okay, that was our greatest punching force. It doesn't make sense to engage against the enemy. Consider that if this is the case, if you look at the numbers, the third line of the Nicaeans was stronger than the Epirot contingent, and so it would have not made sense to make a last stand, like to hope to engage against such enemy that after all had a victorious second line that yes would have been exhausted and just as horse archers probably run to plunder the enemy camp rather than actually putting up a fight, because they would exhaust the arrows and the forces at the same time. Again, nothing special, but again the enemy third line was sort of the stronger, the Nicaeans, a bit like again the Easterners in general tendentially had deployed the greatest force in the rear, whereas the so to create more reserves, more distance with the shock force of the enemy had to be absorbed, softened up, and overwhelmed, whereas the Westerners in fact had gone in with the full shock force. Again, the 300 elites from the Nicaean side are also again minimal compared to this broader quantities, right? So it's an interesting hybrid, admittedly, but also the difference in sort of Western-Eastern character between the two hosts is pretty clear, right? There is not just a winning or a losing strategy in this, but it sort of made sense for the Nicaeans to deploy like this, right? And about the allies, one could speculate, but it was not a bad strategy either, right? We're told by Pachimeres that the Turks and the Cumans carried out the pursuit, which could be done again. That this was tiring to an extent, but it was easy because the enemy was broken psychophysically, and so at least you were on horseback, and they would have just surrendered. I mean, that we do not know about. Probably some of these Latin knights put up some last fight, but surrendered in the end. I mean, the episode of the Lord of Carytines is quite eloquent. He's convinced to surrender, so it's not like that he gave up immediately. So that's how we've seen also in many other battles, that there is always somebody who sacrifices himself to allow the others to escape. And actually the Latins may have done this for even the Epirotes. It may have even happened this, telling the truth. We see Acropolitus says that Manfred's men surrendered to 4 Nicaeans, which is also a bit like humiliating to say, oh look, these guys, we appeared with 4 guys and 400 surrendered. But you know, this is again Acropolitus being very, you know, biased and to the point of lack of objectivity. There were, this is not important, I mean, who did that? The losses were light among the Epirotes, which again can easily have happened even if they had actually been on the battlefield that day and fled before they could engage with the enemy battle lines. Sanudo says that Manfred's men were killed and the rest robbed. So also here different accounts, at least on how things technically happened. Other sources celebrate the number of the allies' deaths. Gregoras says that the most of the enemies were killed. The Chronicle of Morea says that the dead were so many that it took 2 days to bury them. Right, so this may be an exaggeration, but you don't have to think that, I mean, yes, it would take that much, I mean, a couple of days to to bury them also just in time before the composition could make things also dangerous as far as epidemics, etc. Right, surely remaining on the battlefield also after 3 days was the usefully conventional amount of time to prove you had won, but it also stems from these sanitary precautions, because especially in summer, you can imagine what would happen to those corpses, especially if they weren't buried in the process. They had that useful time. There is, however, an interesting indicator, that is the fact that no notable person that fell in this battle or in the aftermath is named by the Chronicle of Morea itself. This is interesting. This is also true for the other sources. Nobody says that. So could this mean that actually losses were lighter? It depends, really. I wouldn't know how to answer this question, if not by pointing out that, having read the accounts, that level of detail is not required for the level of the general one, the average one of the entire works, for how they're written, right? The same Chronicle of Morea is just, again, a couple of pages if you read them about the battle, so it spends more time about the dialogues, also for the surrender of the Lord of Caritina, that the actual, in explaining the actual battle engagement, right? So you can't expect too many informations, especially from a guy that was essentially rewriting this in the 14th century, but substantially later. And so it's, again, we're also talking 1259 Greece, as I was saying before, the same Latins that were in Greece, this barons from France, or it's not that they even spent too much time writing about this. First of all, because it was a defeat to some extent, but especially because it was something that they would have not cared, or it was also better not to talk too much about in France, right? From France, and so these were knights after all. The important thing about this, I would also say, is that while in France you would have had communal communities that would have already been habituated to write fairly rich chronicles, etc., Greece was not like that. So given that these were essentially Western knights in a Byzantine society, like a Byzantine society did not produce much information. You can see it from the official Byzantine chronicles as well, Michael VIII and his successors. They're extremely, contained sources in many ways. The actual Latin knights were not necessarily very educated people who would write, especially chronicles. That's something mostly the commoner would write, an educated merchant or something like that. Yes, there were noblemen who wrote. Think about the chronicle, The Life of Saint Louis by Jean de Joinville. We are in the same years, but they are exceptional in many ways, right? And this context is sort of more peripheral, so it's completely normal. And I do think actually that there were heavy losses from the Latin side in this battle, even if they were not specifically named. Many of these guys, as we will see now, were actually captured rather than killed. This is true. We're particularly told that during the retreat, of course, across, as we've seen, the plain of Pelagonia, many Vlachs of Thessaly robbed, captured, and killed these other, especially the Epirot infantrymen, were the ones that were, again, also with siding with the Latins. It's funny because some of these guys, or many of them, would have been same Vlachs, right? And you know that the Vlachs were just robbing or killing or capturing for ransom basically everybody. They didn't give a damn. And as we've seen, there was also a lot of tension depending on under whose noblemen they were. Byzantines, but whether of Thessaly or Epirus, so that is a discriminant that you want to take in consideration. The Epirot notables were instead capable of putting themselves to flight more safely, because again the Vlachs were just a bunch of brigands fundamentally, so they're not really putting together an army, I don't know, to stop the retreat of the Epirot forces that are actually not just stronger than them, but technically they are protecting them from the Nicaeans, right? And there is a complex picture. In fact, even about the aftermath, we know that the Nicaeans took many towns in the area, right? There were some Nicaean officers who marched to the same Epirus, they capturing even the capital Arta and besieging the other important center of Ioannina. So they arrived literally on the Adriatic, on the Ionian Sea. Then John Palaiologos moved with John the Bastard, that did really betray, to Boeotia. Thebes was plundered. This is interesting because the Thessalians, the son of the legitimate son of despot of Epirus, was ruling Thessaly, that again, as the Balkan hinterland suggests, would be just more predatory and waiting, as always, as it had been for centuries, to plunder the richer Greek cities of the Aegean, right? So John the Bastard had definitely something going on, and again, there is no evidence he betrayed in the main accounts, just in one, right? And it's sort of strange that the Epirotes would have allowed that, even if they hadn't been okay with it, so I don't think it really happened. But the guy may have easily passed, and may have just not been there before the battle, having already defected, right? But there is surely something about this too, because we know that John the Bastard, after having plundered Thebes, defected again, switching sides, joining his father's one again. So it may have actually been a circumstantial thing. The Nicaeans winning the battle, the guy finding himself in trouble and wanting to maybe cripple a Latin center like Thebes and making some money. And when pressure was finally released, coming back to his father's side. As we've seen, nobody really liked much of each other, right? But it is also true that Manfred, knowing of the defeat of Pelagonia, actually sent his troops